Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you live from the SCC studios out of White Bear Lake. This evening it is May 11th, 2016. And so with it being a live broadcast, I encourage you to call in with any questions or comments that you may have, either for myself, my guest, or maybe you have some other insight into the topic that you would like to express on the air. Now, we are also simultaneously broadcast to those studios out of the CTV studios, the Roseville studios, and the SPNN studios in St. Paul. So we're very happy to have such a wide live audience for this evening's program. Now, we do re-cablecast at other dates and times and in other stations. So if you happen to find yourself watching our program on a date and time other than our live cablecast, well, unfortunately you won't be able to call in, but certainly you can reach me on Facebook 24/7. Now, this evening we are going to be talking about a workshop that was held recently in Maplewood, talking about recommendations of a task force regarding emergency management services in Maplewood. And to help me with this topic this evening is my good friend, Mr. Joe Waters, who's been a regular on these programs over the past few years, and also very knowledgeable in the area of EMS. So with that, I welcome you and thank you, Mr. Waters, for being here.
And thank you for inviting me, Bear.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, you have a very strong background in EMS. You were a district fire chief, what, 26 years?
Well, I was with the fire department for 26 years. The last 9 years, roughly, 99 to 2007, last 8 years, as district chief. So I was more of a command supervisor, if you will.
Right. So you certainly have a lot of historical perspective, and I know that you also keep on top of this topic by really looking at what other fire departments are doing throughout the nation.
Well, right, because when I first heard about this group, just for full disclosure to your audience, I did express my interest to Melinda Coleman, the city manager of Maplewood. I never heard back. And after about 2 weeks, I figured, well, this group's going to get going. But I want to monitor from the side because I want to see what this group would come up with that would be specific to Maplewood. And if we have time, I can talk about some other communities that I know are looking at alternatives to EMS delivery, if you will. Not necessarily EMS in the emergency sense, but medical services delivery in the field. And we even have some here in the city. So, you know, I just find it rather fascinating because it's the fire service is known as 350 years of history impeded by progress. So, you know, this is progress. Things are changing, and you know, they're as we get into this, you'll find they're looking at more of how do we prevent emergencies rather than just responding to them, just like we did with fires. How do we prevent fires, which brings down the number of fires? How do we prevent emergencies? How do we prevent injuries, which then brings down the number of calls?
Right, and I know that they actually spoke to that at some part of the meeting where they discussed that the various steps that we take today for fire suppression, whether or not if it's sprinklers or other types of efforts in buildings, has eliminated a lot of the need for a fire department per se.
Well, basically, basically what has happened is it started from the education piece. And you actually started by educating the children, who in turn took the information home to their parents. You know, we shouldn't be using candles near our Christmas trees. You know, we should be checking out our extension cords because we have the cord going under the rug. Over time, the cord's going to wear out just from walking on it. You know, when you turn your stove on, you know, double check to make sure you turn your stove off. You know, simple, basic things. And then we got into the smoke detectors. You know, again, no, don't smoke in bed. You know, smoking in bed, smoking can be bad for your health anyways, but then no smoking in bed stuff like that.
That might hasten the process a little quicker.
Exactly. I mean, it didn't totally, the goal of the fire service was to quote unquote eliminate itself, but you're really never going to truly eliminate the fire department because
Right.
as you have different groups coming in, they're bringing their norms from another country, and then you have to go in and tell these folks, we don't do that here, and this is why we don't do it. And it's all, and if you take it from the aspect as one fire inspector that I learned from, we're here to protect your investment. If you spend $350,000, $400,000 for a house, you want that protected. You want that investment protected. The fire department takes a proactive approach. This is how you protect that investment. So, but yes, our goal would be to eventually put us out of business. How many government agencies would do that? It is to put ourselves out of business, but at the same time, we're also here to educate the public.
Right, exactly. And certainly there's always going to be some unpredictable things that will cause a fire, whether or not if it's lightning or there's a short in the wiring or
a man-made,
Yeah.
intentional.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yes.
what I'm saying. That's
Yes.
why you're
They're-
never truly
right.
going to get rid of the fire department. But in the days of, the olden days, even 50, 60 years ago, from some of the behaviors we did then, we've pretty much been able to say, hey, don't do that. And, this is what we're here to protect. Even in building construction, if you got a 100-year-old house, it's probably a two-story 100-year-old house. It's probably built with, maybe a 20 or 30-foot stud, and there's no fire stops between the floors. Now, with today's building code, you would have fire stops in between the floors. So, through technology, we've been able to compartmentalize the fires. As another person I knew said, fire service started out by first we burned down the world, then we burned down the state, then we burned down just the neighborhood, then we burned down just the building. Now we're compartmentalizing it to one location.
Right, yeah, exactly. Now with the film footage that we have, the first few clips are basically introductory. They give you sort of a foundation coming into this topic, and this was Monday night's workshop. So let's take a look at our first clip.
Members of the City Council, I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the main priorities of the work group. And as most of you know, this is a new formula for us to engage our residents and to help us with some strategic programs that we're working on. And I guess first of all, the priority of the work group, and you're going to hear, they're going to be introduced, and you'll be hearing from each of them individually in just a few minutes. But they were meant to, they were kind of, as they were working through the strategic planning, they identified a system of 3 core principles, or guiding principles, as they were working through that. And that includes, number 1, excellence in service delivery, 2, responsible stewardship of public resources, and 3, a standard of fairness that would be applied to those delivering EMS fire services and those who are receiving those services. So that was sort of the foundation or beginning of their work.
Now that, of course, is City Manager Melinda Coleman. And she talked about this is going to be a new model for engaging citizens and helping to discover solutions to city problems. Well, now, certainly, I don't have any problem with the idea of incorporating citizens within the structure to find solutions. But my question is that how did they find these citizens to serve on this task force? Did they have an open application process? Did anybody know that they were seeking people to serve on this? Or were they already pre-hand selected? Now, I don't know if either you or I have the answer to that.
Yeah, we don't have the answer to it. I mean, I have my own feelings just from listening to city council meetings and so forth. I think they were pre-selected. Personally, myself. Okay, fine. That's just the way life is. They pre-selected. But I would like, if you want true citizen engagement, I think there should be some sort of an application process, and it should be an ongoing thing. And then, say your name comes up, my name comes up, or someone else's name comes up, saying we're looking to put, okay, you've got this task force together that's really going to stay together to deal with this particular issue. But maybe they move on to the community center. That's where you should have an ongoing process be able to pick names saying, would you be interested in sitting on this task force to review the community center? Rather than waiting until you get the authorization to have the group and then go through the process, because that's only delaying it. It's almost like jury selection, if you really look at it. We're going to draw your name. If your name gets drawn, and I've been drawn for both federal and Ramsey County jury duty, and they just send you a subpoena saying show up at such and such a time, and you don't know what case you're going to deal with until you basically are selected to sit on that particular jury. So you could I think you could do the same thing here with these community engagement, community work groups. Have a group of people that have a bunch of names ready to go, but in this particular case, since it's not mandatory, you would say, would you be willing, this is the group, this is the one we're putting together, would you be willing to sit on this group?
Right. And what concerns me with this concept that this might be this new model is that if it isn't an open selection process of some type, or that there's some process like you described where there's people who are interested, they've got their name in the hat, so to speak, and then they get pulled from there, that if the people of Maplewood don't know who is being appointed to these subcommittees, these task force, they don't have any accountability over what those people are deciding and recommending for Maplewood. It's like there's a hidden level of governance underneath the elected officials. And maybe it wouldn't be so bad if they had their meetings public noticed so the public could attend, and that they had them cable cast so the public could watch the discussions. But in this task force, they had neither of those.
Right. And this is where I'm going to differ from you. Normally, I would agree to openness in any types of commissions, boards, and so forth. But I think sometimes when you have these task forces together, you're dealing with ordinary, everyday citizens. Sometimes I believe maybe they shouldn't have the same scrutiny as a board or a commission or the city council, because sometimes they need to have honest, open discussions with data that maybe shouldn't be released in public right away, because it could very easily be misused, in my opinion. This is just my opinion only, because I think you want these work groups to really be able to dive into a situation without the glaring of a camera, over their shoulder.
Well, what about noticing them to the public so the public could attend, they even know the meetings are being held?
There's nothing wrong with noticing them, that they could attend, but the public has to understand you're allowed to attend, you're allowed to observe, but this is not, the participants are the work group.
Right.
So when it gets to the policymakers, that's when your input comes into place.
Right.
But you got to give the work group the ability to have open and honest discussions without it turning into a political hot potato.
Right.
Because
and that's, well, I think there, certainly, I guess that some people do feel that maybe they might posture for the camera if the camera was there. But on the other hand, maybe they wouldn't. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Exactly.
So now let's take a look at our next clip. I believe it's Melinda Coleman going on. Oh, and before though we do that, she had talked about the three goals of this task force.
Excellence, responsibility, and fairness.
Yeah, and those sound like good goals to be working towards. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's take a look at our next clip.
As I also wanted to point out that the concept of the citizens staff work group is also tied to the city's strategic objectives. And we have been talking about our strategic objectives now for a year, and we're fine-tuning those in the next couple months. But I just wanted to remind the council that 4 of our 5 strategic objectives really are incorporated into this process. And those are, number 1, coordinated communication. Using this work group model, which includes engaging residents, our staff together in planning for the future, really ties to that communication goal. Secondly, effective governance. This work group was committed to creating a long-term vision for fire EMS services. And 3, financial sustainability. We want to provide quality services that reflect community values, and they're also supported by available resources. And 4, operational effectiveness. This is where we value organizational efficiencies, which are based on data, performance, and accountability. And
So, you know, it sounds nice, all these different things that she's laid out there. But when we're talking about, again, looking at engaging the public and trying to get the input from the public, we don't know really where, even with the pinpoint on a map, where each one of these representatives came from. Because if they're all from one area of Maplewood, is that representative?
No, it's not.
And if you don't have diversity on your task force.
Okay, well, before you go any further, when you say diversity, what do you talk about in diversity?
Well, that's a good question. The council never defined what they would like to see for the diversity on this task force.
And the only reason why I ask that, because a lot of people think when you hear the word diversity, oh, it's racial diversity. No, to me it's beyond racial diversity. It's diversity of thought.
Yes.
I'll give you an example real quickly. I don't always agree with Bob Zick. Matter of fact, 90% of the time I don't agree with him. But it's his diverse opinion. My dad always said, listen to the other person's opinion. You don't have to agree with him, but listen to the other person's opinion. That's, to me, is diversity.
Right.
Because he could come in from one direction, I could come in from another, and it may be somewhere in the middle, one way or another. That's how we come to a solution. That, to me, that's real diversity.
Absolutely, and I agree with you 100%. And I think that oftentimes they want to look at racial diversity as that's the way that they think that they're going to get diversity of opinions based upon somebody's ethnicity.
And ethnicity, and that's not the case.
And that isn't the case, because they may all live in the south end of Maplewood and still have the South Maplewood viewpoint on response times.
Exactly. Exactly.
You see, and so I think it's a point well taken that you've brought up, is that we do not know, because we don't know how these folks were selected, we have no understanding of their diversity of thought, or even we do hear, though, through the course of the meeting, some of their backgrounds, and some of their backgrounds appear to be, you know, good backgrounds for being on this task force.
Correct.
But we also don't know, again, how were they selected? Do they have biases? That may be a bias that you'd want to have somebody else on that task force that had a counter bias.
Correct. That's what I mean by diversity. That's exactly what I mean by diversity.
Yeah. So let's take a look at our next clip.
Where we came to you with Chief Snell back in January of 2016, talked a little bit about some of our needs and asked that you would authorize this group to be formed and to do their due diligence. The community and staff representation here today, we actually had 11 meetings, and I wish I could say they all lasted 4 hours, because every one of the 11 lasted way over the 4 hours that we had. But in all, they were great meetings. A lot of positive information was received. They asked some of the best questions I've ever had, and what I would really like to make sure that you're all aware of, we have the best informed citizens in how EMS runs, I would say, in any city within this, within the great state of Minnesota. They asked a lot of great questions, as well as asked for a lot of data that was really good. We met starting February 22nd, and we finalized ourselves on April 29th.
So 11 meetings. And did I hear correctly that each meeting lasted over 4 hours long?
It was at least 4 hours, if not longer.
You know, that's longer than our council meetings last now.
Correct.
Our council meetings in Maplewood, there is no discussion. There is no diversity of thought.
Right.
And you also can't tell from what they're talking about what really the underlying discussion points might have been in the back room. But here we've got a task force where you've got folks that are spending 4 hours or more per meeting asking for data. Now, I'd like to know, now that it's all over and done with, and they've got their recommendations, I'd like to see the data.
Well, so would I. You know, so would I. You know, You know, because I know when they talk about our response times are under, they say our response times are under national average. I know the response time in Minnesota is either 15 minutes or 20 miles, whichever is shorter. What is our response time? Because I know the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association standard, you know, from the time a call comes in to the time a call, time a unit arrives on the scene, it's a pretty narrow window. It doesn't cover EMS; it pretty much covers fire. But I would like to know what it is for EMS.
Right, exactly. And I don't think during that workshop that number ever came up.
No, I did not hear a number.
No. Amazing. That one of the most important things of the whole issue, what is the response time? And it was never said what the average is.
Right, but I'd also dig in, well, I was going to say, I'd kind of dig into that. You know, I'm not looking just at the response
Right,
time. I'm
that's
actually
true.
looking at where the unit is coming from. Is it coming from a station?
Right.
Or is it coming from a hospital or from some other point?
Yes, and which is also very important data to understand
It is-
the operational
Right,
aspects
because
of
if,
it.
you know, if this is happening on a regular basis, that tells me something else as well.
Right.
Or at least gets me thinking in another direction. Do we have enough units out on the street to deal with the call volume
Mm-hmm.
during a specific time period?
Right, exactly. So now let's skip ahead 2 clips.
Of this group wanted to ensure that our citizens and our customers, our patients, are going to continue to receive excellence in public service. We wanted to make sure that we developed mechanisms to make sure we were utilizing sound stewardship of our resources and ensure that there's fairness throughout the city so that all of our customers, all of our citizens, patients have access to the same level of care. And we also wanted to be sustainable in those actions so that we're not continually revisiting this issue every 2 years. We wanted to come up with a plan that's going to last the test of time. Part of creating that model of sustainability forced us to use approaches that aren't traditional to the fire service and really think outside of our previous paradigms, and Dick Baldwin will get into that a little bit more in the future.
Now, he mentioned this concept of having uniform fairness throughout all of Maplewood for all of the customers or patients that are calling for service. And is that with regard to response time or how their need for service is addressed? I wasn't quite sure what he meant by fairness.
My interpretation is clearly you want to, you know, you don't want to make sure that one part of the city, it's taking longer to get one part of the city than it is to another.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you know, and this is sometimes we've had a caller from the south end that watched that fire station down there. They don't want to be, they don't want to take 10 minutes to get to their call, or maybe in the Gladstone area it only takes 3 minutes. So that's a fairness issue. When they walk into the door, they're treating them all with respect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just because it's somebody that has an accent, they're treating them differently than someone that's native to this country. That's what I interpret to be fairness. But yes, they didn't lay out an example what they were looking at in fairness. But those are the kind of fairness issues that I'm looking at. That maybe this part of town's getting the newest ambulance, the newest equipment, and the newest technology, where this part of town, they're dealing with yesterday's technology, yesterday's ambulance, you know, and they're dealing with yesterday's leftover because it's a poor part of town, it has a low number of calls, what have you. You know, everyone is treated the same. That's kind of how I look at fairness. But again, he did not give any examples. There were no examples given of what you would consider, you know, examples of fairness that you're trying to achieve.
And I would think that depending upon your community, that what that issue of fairness is, as you indicated, could be indeed one part of town is treated differently than the other, or that the response times, but without really identifying what that means to Maplewood. We don't really know what they looked at, certainly not at this point. So let's take a look at our next clip.
Oh, sorry, go back one. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. So previously to meeting with this work group, the Maplewood Fire and EMS response operating principles were to deliver the right resource for the right reason or for the right person in an appropriate amount of time. And that's pretty consistent with fire departments and fire-based EMS throughout the country. with changes in healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement came out with which is called the triple aim. So they talk about improving population health, experience of care, and controlling per capita cost. And a lot of reimbursement is tied to that in the healthcare arena. Military installations, including the Air Force, developed the quadruple aim, which in the middle of that aim is the readiness circle. So when we're looking at all these services that we deliver, we want to really focus on population health. We want it to control costs. We want to have our patients, our customers, our citizens to really enjoy and have an excellent experience in care. But there's also a readiness component that any fire-based EMS system needs to be capable of responding to emergencies throughout.
Now, Joe, in looking at those two perspectives, certainly that last one, when I'm looking at that, it seems to be a little bit more expansive, that it's not necessarily just reactive, that it's looking at being more proactive. Because if you're looking at, what is the health of the population, what is the, the experience, well, that has happened, but, looking at the health of the population, that's something more futuristic. And rather than being just, reactive, okay, we've got a call, now we go to it, and this is how we need to handle that call the best we can at that time when we're called to do so.
Well, when they talk about the health of the population, let's take the Gladstone area. It's kind of the oldest part of the city. So you're going to have a lot more seniors. You're going to have a lot more people in their 50s, but really got a lot more people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s that are still alive, and even possibly into their 90s. So what issues is that age group or that age segment dealing with? Are they dealing with a lot more slips and falls? Are they dealing with a lot more cardiac? Is that a group that for most of their lives were smokers and then were able, as time went on, stop smoking? So how do you address those potential futuristic needs without being reactive? If you're dealing with a lot of slip and falls, it's largely an educational piece, but it may require some work on the part of the individuals themselves. For instance, I think one example was given, the slips and falls. When you get in the bathtub, are you slipping and falling when because you're more frail? Are you slipping and falling in the bathtub? Well, that can be. There's some simple solutions there. There's certain bathtubs you can buy that you can walk in rather than stepping over. Is it a matter of putting down grit on the bottom of your bathtub, so when you're in the bathtub, you're not slipping and falling. You've got some sort of friction, or you're
right.
gripping, your feet are gripping on something, so you're not slipping and falling. Maybe putting in handrails to help you get in and out. Is it cardiac related? That's working with your primary care physician. Changing your eating habits. Instead of eating, fatty foods and stuff that build up in cholesterols, maybe you're more health conscious, and I've tried that. Sometimes that food doesn't taste so great, but it may help it's probably going to help your long-term health.
Right.
On the other hand, is it just high-risk behavior? Are you doing really stupid things? Classic one that really irritates me to this day, and it's another issue we need to talk about. Are you getting into the crosswalk when it says don't walk, and the other person coming the other way has the green light? That's high-risk behavior.
That is high-risk behavior.
That's when it irritates me, because it's almost like you're asking to be hit. How do we change that high-risk behavior so that we're not responding to hit and runs and all this other type of stuff? That's looking at the population,
right?
And that goes beyond. I think that readiness component goes beyond just the fire-based EMS system. That potentially includes maybe all of the health products or services that are available.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the point that they were making, is that model actually is from another aspect of health
Correct.
care delivery, but that there was aspects of it that they could look to in their study of the Maplewood EMS.
Correct.
And making recommendations. That's correct. So let's take a look at our next clip.
To take good care of us. Thank you.
So let's just stop it here for a moment and let's pull up that list of strengths, because I think it is good to show the strengths that they identified. Let's back it up. There we go. So the strengths that they identified is the people, the capabilities, technology, response time, history of adaptability and agility, industry leading EMS practices, and history of ability to collaborate. And I think that certainly in Maplewood, we have agreements with our neighboring communities as well. Whether or not if it's, and you know more about what those different type of agreements, there's two types of agreement, correct?
Well, you've got, I think you're talking about the auto aid and the mutual aid?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
The auto aid basically says if you call 911 and there's an emergency, you're going to get assistance not only from the community you're in, but maybe the neighboring community at the push of a button. That's set and done. For instance, just say there was an accident, a major accident up at the Maplewood Mall, and someone says, yeah, there's a bus of kids that are screaming, okay? You may get all 3 Maplewood ambulances up there, but you may get White Bear coming, and they may push a button and say, send White Bear in, because they're pretty close. And then push that other, and at the same time when you push that button, get Lakeview in here right away, because we're potentially looking at a mass casualty incident. We want as many resources as soon as possible. Mutual aid basically says if that same bus accident happens up by the Maplewood Mall, Maplewood will get there with its resources, and then they realize that the incident's bigger than what Maplewood can handle, the first person on the scene, they'll say, get me White Bear, get me Lakeview, and so on. That's mutual aid. But that has to be, auto aid is done, it's automatic, you get the resources. Mutual aid says when someone gets there and makes a determination, if they need more help, call for more help. When I think of collaboration, it goes beyond, because that's the reactive mode. Mm-hmm. When I think of collaborations, we have St. John's Hospital. And when they came into the area back into the 80s, they wanted to be the regional kind of emergency room for the East Metro, because at that time, it pretty much was, you had either Ramsey, which is now Regions Hospital, or HCMC. When St. John's moved out of St. Paul and moved to Maplewood, they wanted to be the regional emergency care facility for this region of the Metro. So you have mass injuries, maybe you have 5 broken legs. Well, you know they're going to need rehab. Well, St. John's being part of Health East, I know has a rehab facility. That's the type of collaboration that comes in. Okay, we got 5 broken legs. These people are going to need rehab. Well, maybe you got one person that is just psychologically broken up. They can't handle it. So they bring in, the psychologist to help them deal with the situation. You may have another one that, for some unknown reason, gets an eating disorder out of that. Well, it's psychological, but they have the folks that will help with eating disorders. That's what when I look at collaboration, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at things that you wouldn't, instead of just sending the reactive people in there, you're bringing in people that are going to help you deal with your issue and then proactively help you move forward from there. That's collaboration to me.
Right. Good point. So let's go on to our next clip.
Hi, John Donofrio. I asked them to switch the rotation of the slides a little bit because I wanted you to see the trend lines first. So you can look at the trends across the bottom, total calls, EMS calls, and fire. And can you put the next slide on real quick? So total calls, transports, non-transports. So if you were a business and you look at those lines, you guys could be really excited. I mean, everything's trending up, looks really good. If you were a business, it would be, I want to put money in that. The reality is, when you see what those lines are about, probably a business that would say, I want out of that. I don't want any part of it. So that's the reality, and we'll explain how that works. So if we go to the next page. So the challenges that the department has is the increase in EMS demand. So Maplewood's not really a growing city compared to many cities, but we have an aging population, we have senior housing. All those things suggest more people that need more emergency medical help. So that's why the trend lines start to go up for a number of calls. More demand in the same geography. So when you think about that demand, we have phenomenally successful departments. But in theory, they run on a shoestring. Their headcount hasn't doubled or tripled. with the historic demand, let alone the demand that will come over the next few years. That's the part that you need to think about when you look at the trend lines. An increase in low acuity calls. So as the generations change, the way we use our emergency systems change. For most of you, if you were smaller, you fell out of a tree, you broke your wrist because you fell on your bike, your parent probably would have put you in a car, they would have taken you to the emergency room. Would not have needed to call 911, expected all these guys to come to your house with an ambulance, with emergency medical, with 10 people, with medicines. Your dad would have took you in, you would have waited in the emergency room, and 3 or 4 hours later you would have come home with a cast on and dealt with that. Different challenge. As the generations changed, as the country has taught people to dial 911 for most anything, we do. Some of those are true emergencies, some are not. Some are, my kid cut their finger, I don't know what to do about it.
And I think that is one of the #1 things I've heard from many firefighters and paramedics is when they go out on a call, you have to respond whether or not if it's life-threatening or somebody has a hangnail.
That's correct, because it comes in a 911 center. They get the basic information. What's the nature of your emergency? What's your address? Are you the caller? So forth. Boom, and the call goes out, and they have to show up. Now, that's when you talked about a low acuity call. When you talked about falling out of a tree, breaking your wrist, and your parents would take you to the hospital. I had an accident like that myself when I was like 4 or 5 years old. I cut my lip on a bicycle chain, and it'd be taken to the hospital to have stitches. At that time, it was taken to Gillette Children's Hospital. My mom and dad took me to the hospital. I had stitches on my lip. I'm probably my grip for a couple of months, and that was it. There was no EMS system. We had the police department, we had the fire department, but we never thought about calling them. They just took, they took me to the hospital. So when he talks about that low acuity calls, they've been sick, they've been feeling ill for the last 5 days, and then suddenly 2 in the morning they decide to call 911 because they want to go to the hospital. If they've been feeling that ill and it hasn't been a downward decrease, a taxi could have taken you to the hospital.
Right.
But if you were feeling ill and all of a sudden shortness of breath and a bunch of other problems, that's a high acuity call because there's a potential life-threatening situation there. So yeah, it's when they get the call, they go, and it's kind of been drilled into us in the fire service. We're there to serve the community, so we end up being, as they say, the primary care for some folks ends up being delivered out of the back of an ambulance.
And so what are are there some solutions though that communities can look at on how to address that, to help people realize the difference between when you really call 911 and when you should say, well, I think I should just take a taxi to the hospital?
Well, here's the dilemma, because we've often said we're the ones that are trained to deal with it. That's why you call us.
Right.
And that's what's drilled into the public's mind. On the other hand, if you tell the public, if you're really not having chest pains, if you're having X, Y, or Z, it may be an emergency to you, but to us it's not an emergency. Maybe we should call a taxi. But then there's something. The problem is the what if. That big what if
exactly
is what kind of it always kept supervisors like me awake. What if we tell them that and something goes wrong?
Right.
It's going to come back and haunt us. And then next thing you know, no offense to the legal profession, the lawyers are knocking at the door with the subpoena saying, you told my patient to do this. This is what happened to him. Now they got a permanent disability. So on the other hand, so it's better to be safe than sorry. But you're dealing with a lot of those situations. We get there and evaluate the situation. Maybe you should take a taxi. But then it could take an hour or 2 hours for a taxi to show up.
Right, and by that time maybe something has changed too in the health condition. And maybe our viewers aren't aware of this, but when a call goes into 911, are those calls, are they prioritized in any way, or is it just whatever call comes in, that's the next one that goes out?
Well,
whether it's as critical or not as critical as another one.
There are some cities, I don't know about, I can't speak to the metro area anymore because I don't hang around dispatch. I know in other cities, there are other cities that do prioritize those type of calls. When in doubt, it becomes a high priority call. But what they'll try to do is they'll try to get the basic information, who the caller is, what's the nature of the call, Is it you or is it someone else? And then if they feel it's a high priority call, they'll dispatch it. But then they'll keep you on the line to get more information. So maybe you'll start out code 3, or maybe you'll start out routine. As they get more information, they'll say speed it up to code 3, or maybe they'll say slow down. This is, we're getting more information. With what they call MDTs, or mobile display terminals, which are basically computers, they can pass out more information to the responding unit.
Right, and I think
And
too.
then that can determine whether they continue code 3 or if they should slow down or not.
Right, and seeing that would be very important to understand that, again, when you're looking at response times. Because if there is that prioritization being done somewhere else at the beginning of that call, you can't just then say, well, I'm just only going to look at response times as that measurement of whether or not we're serving the needs of the community.
Correct.
Then suddenly response time has to be correlated with how was that call prioritized.
Correct. And at the same time, they have this thing called the Clausen system, which it's written by a doctor, I think it was Craig Clausen. It basically says you ask these basic questions up front. That'll determine what gets the resources going. But then you keep the caller on the line and you ask additional information. That's where I said you can pass that information on to the responding units as you get more and more information, because at the same time, maybe it is what we refer to as a full arrest. They're not breathing, the heart stopped, and they give instructions on doing CPR over the phone, because one person will give the instruction and another dispatcher will say, we're giving CPR instructions over the phone, we're going to send you additional resources onto this call as well. I don't know if they still do it or not. I know in the city of LA at one point, the city of LA owned the bus system. The bus system in this area is run by Metropolitan Transit Commission, or Metropolitan Transit Operation, which is run by the Metropolitan Council. But in the city of LA, if they were in doubt, they would send a unit to investigate. And if they got there, they would say, okay, we don't need to transport you because you got a city of 3.5 million people. Our ambulances are busy, but if you go down to the corner and take the bus and tell them you want to go to such and such hospital, again, probably because the county owns the hospital, they'll take you for free. Now, that's a collaboration that you can do here.
Right.
The Phoenix Fire Department did a situation where if their paramedics got on the scene and decided it was not a true life-threatening emergency, they had they would call back. They'd either give you a voucher that you would give to, you'd call a taxi, and you give the taxi the voucher, and the city would then pay for the trip. Or they had a van that ran, I think it was Monday through Friday, that would take you to the hospital as well. So it kept the EMS unit available for the call, but you were still given the service, but it was given by maybe a third party.
Well, you got me thinking there, because I'm thinking in Maplewood, we have, and I see from time to time they're running around Maplewood cars that say reserve on them. And maybe if we have reserve officers on duty that day, they could serve that type of purpose, that if it is indeed somebody who they don't need an ambulance to bring them to the hospital, but they could use they need to go to the emergency room, but they don't need an ambulance to bring them there.
Correct.
They could get into the car of the reserve officer, and that would really, I think, cut down on some of the costs as well associated with the ambulance trip in and of itself.
Correct.
So that would be something that Maplewood could look at. I wonder if the task force came up with that idea.
Well, the task force did not come up with that specific idea. This is where it looks like there's some changes that are going to be made, because the current assistant chief of EMS will be promoted to, sounds like they want to promote him to chief of EMS. Sounds like what they want to do is they want to recreate the Maplewood Department of Public Safety, which existed prior to the fire department being a city entity, where you have the public safety director, and then maybe you have like a deputy director of police services, deputy director of fire service, and then chief of EMS. And it sounds like, this is just my guess, because someone actually texted me this afternoon saying, did I watch the meeting? I think they're going to try to follow maybe the Woodbury model as far as a command structure is concerned. And the fire department will transport critical patients, but then they'll collaborate with probably Health East or Alliant or so forth, just reading from the notes, on non-critical or non-life-threatening type of situations, which would be a good thing.
Right.
Because they have a larger financial bank that they can rely on, and if that particular patient really doesn't need the services of the emergency room, but some other department within the hospital system, they're already in that,
Right.
that care.
Yeah, and I should point out too for our viewers that Maplewood's ambulance services are unique from most other municipalities in that in Maplewood it's what's called an enterprise fund. And so the funding of the ambulance services and the expenses and all the budgeting is actually kept separate from the general operational budget of the city. And I'm not sure if we're going to get to that clip that we have. I know that we have queued up somewhere in the clips, but most municipalities that have an ambulance service, they actually supplement the costs of that through taxpayer dollars, rather than trying to run it as an enterprise fund where it's supposed to be at least trying to break even with the amount of revenues that come in as opposed to the money that goes out. So that's just to be clear to our viewers. Now I understand that we have a caller on the line, so let's get our caller out here. Questions or comments?
Mayor Longley, Joe Waters. Joe Waters, thanks for this discussion on EMS. I've listened also to part of that Maplewood City meeting, the workshop of the council, and all these. It seemed like everybody was just reading off the script. I heard that they had 10 or 14 meetings, and those were all over 4 hours apiece, and yet nobody knew when those. No one in the public knew when those meetings occurred, and there was no cable call, no tape recording. One thing I heard Paul Schnell complain about is as they get less and less people on health insurance, more voucher housing, they're different than most other cities. And I know the council push is to bring more and more voucher housing to Maplewood. And the thing is, after closing 40% of their fire stations in secret, doing all their ambulance discussions in secret, making the people who commented the poor public citizens, and that's in quote very used lightly because they weren't disclosed during this whole meeting process. My question is, why are they so afraid to put this stuff in public, these meetings in public, so that residents and experts like yourself wouldn't have to speculate what their secrets were, but people would know what their secrets were? When will this end, and how will we know what they're doing? Are they afraid that Steve Lucan is going to be upset if it's in public because he's going to be downgraded? Or what's the issue? Why is the secrecy? I mean, and the question is, like you mentioned, when about the ambulance department, if they do go to that model like you were saying, who's going to make the decision of who gets the care from the ambulance department in Maplewood and who is shifted over? I mean, will the voucher housing people be shifted over to the other ambulance system, or will it be the seniors of Maplewood who are shifted over? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I'll answer that last question part. Who makes a decision whether it's going to be transported by Maplewood or a third party? The incident is going to dictate who gets transported. The protocols. They have protocols that they have to follow. And the protocols are designed to be fair, to be non-discriminatory, regardless of race, age, gender, what have you. So the incident is going to dictate whether or not you get transported by Maplewood or some third-party service. Because if, for instance, you've got a person that has chest pains, but you don't like them because they live in subsidized housing, and you throw them off in a third-party service, and they end up getting worse, you can almost be assured that you're going to be on one of the news stations trying to explain to their lawyer why you did that.
Right.
And
exactly.
that hurts the reputation of the whole organization. So, short answer to that question, the incident is going to dictate it.
Right, and that of course would seem to be the fair, logical, and responsible way of doing it,
That's
because
correct.
after all, it's the service that is being required, and whatever service you need to provide is based upon what the incident is.
It was an
Yeah.
old saying that one time we used to, when we left a scene where we'd go in and evaluate a situation, we always would say, Medic 7's clear, no services required. And we were sitting around one day with the paramedics, police paramedics at that time, and we're like, wait a minute, our services were required. Our services were required to go in and make an evaluation.
Right.
That is a service. So now we'd say no transport, or it's going to be transported by a private party. Because just going in and making an event, if you call because you're having trouble breathing, I don't know, maybe you had a fight with one of your cats and you just got so excited that you hyperventilated. And we went in there with a bag, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, the poor kitty, granted Kitty's giving you a problem and whatnot. Here's what you need to do to calm Kitty down and so forth. You take him over to this animal shelter and you get him, a little tranquilizer, and Kitty will calm down. But in the meantime, you breathe into this bag, and then within, say, 5-10 minutes, you're breathing normal again. You go, oh, thank you. That still required our services.
Right.
We just didn't transport you to the hospital, but that still required our services.
Right,
On
and I was at, actually last year I was at a backyard picnic, and that one of the ladies there, she had, all of a sudden she just blacked out, and there she was on the grass. And the ambulance came, and she came too, but that's part of what they did, is that they did an evaluation of, did she need transport? Did she need to go someplace? What's happening here? And in the end, it was decided no transport needed. But it was indeed services, because there was that evaluation piece, trying to figure out, okay, what about the blood pressure, what about the heartbeat, several other things that they were looking at.
I had that situation with my mother too. I mean, during 2008, there were a number of times that, she was a diabetic and her blood sugar dropped. It just would suddenly drop. I finally figured out what the signs were when her blood pressure was dropping. It was one particular case where I was over in St. Paul. And because I was taking her over to I think it was one of the dollar stores over in St. Paul, because that particular store had something she wanted. And she had this little kid look on her face. I'm like, uh-oh, I know what that is. So quickly I went into Cub to get her some candy to get the sugar back up. And it didn't work, so I ended up taking her over to her church. And I asked one of the guys, would you help me bring her in and get me some sugar water? Because I had learned that trick from a nurse, a longtime family friend who was a retired nurse. That didn't work. That's when I said, get St. Paul up here. They came in and they tried putting an IV, and it didn't work. And then there was one medication that they were going to use, and the medic says, well, I don't want to use this medication yet because it's like $300 a shot. If I can get her back doing this other technique, I'll do that first. But if I can't get her back with this technique, then I will use that medication. He was trying to save my mother some money, which I understood, and I explained the whole situation to him. She ended up coming back. And then she started laughing. And then that was a situation where the services were required to get her blood sugar back up. They just didn't transport.
Right, exactly. So let's go on to our next clip.
Things about paradigms. Paradigms essentially are frameworks that we see the world through, and concepts. And one of the problems we have with the fire EMS service now is we're looking at it through a paradigm that probably can't be sustainable, that we need to shift our paradigm from what it is today, which is an emergency response system, to something else. And we tried to figure out what that something else was as we went along. But essentially, I guess the way it was explained to me once was, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And so that's kind of the way we're looking at things now with the emergency response system, because the way it works now is people call and we have to respond. We don't have any choice. We have to go. and we try to get there with the best available resources in the shortest amount of time. And our calls.
So that, in a nutshell, really encapsulates what we've been talking about here, is that they have to figure out how to adjust their paradigm. Do they respond to every single call, or, as you indicated, figure out, who, based on the incident, who's going to cover which call?
Well, I'll give you an example. And the city of Mesa, Arizona, got a $3 million grant from the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Studies to look at community paramedicine. And they're focusing on behavioral issues. When you talk about mental ill, you had that shooting last fall in St. Paul, and the family is saying, well, he was mentally ill. He should, instead of shooting him, you should have helped him. Well, the cops took it differently because they saw that he had a weapon, so they felt it was a life-threatening situation. But in the case of the city of Mesa, Arizona, through the Mesa Fire and Medical Department, they are now having a nurse and dispatch center. So when a 911 calls in, and it turns out to be some sort of mental crisis, they will put the nurse on the phone. They'll say, can we put the nurse on the phone? And this nurse, he or she, will start asking a series of questions. If the nurse is in doubt, they'll say, push the button, send the resources, the paramedics and the police. On the other hand, if they start to calm the person down, if the person's really calm, they'll send a community SUV out there with the community paramedics to help work with this person, and then in turn, we'll transport them very quietly to a secure facility, a hospital and so forth, where they can get treatment, because it's not a life-threatening situation where
Right.
the ABCs need to be addressed, but this is another issue, and then they get them into that care where the care that they really need, rather than get them locked up in what we say is a rubber room.
Right, and just simply transporting them to an emergency room isn't necessarily the best use of resources to address the issue that they have.
Correct.
And that you're really using your resources wisely to get them lined up with the incident, the person, and what their needs are.
Right.
And it just seems to be a much more holistic way of looking
And
at
that's exactly how they're looking at it.
you're administering your services in your community.
Exactly. Because as one retired St. Paul firefighter who said, we need to get back to the emergency in EMS, emergency medical services. We need to get back to the emergency. It's just like urgent care or the emergency room. We're dealing with a specific problem versus this place being a primary care place to resolve your issue, or just responding to everything that comes in the door.
Right, exactly. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Waters, for coming on the program this evening and helping me to unpack all of this information from the workshop. We only got halfway through our clips. That's because the workshop was really long and there was a lot there.
And there's more to come.
And there's more to come for sure. So maybe we can do part 2 on another program. But again, I want to thank you very much. And viewers, thank you for tuning in to Off the Record News. Hope to see you again next week. Same time, same place. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mayor. My question is actually for Mr. Dawson, if that's all right. Looking at really pretty significant shift in priorities, as Chief Schnell put it, simply really kind of inverting the priorities in some ways from probably what is today. What's your feeling as kind of speak for firefighters? What's your feeling about that, and what do you think is the kind of future for you and your colleagues based on that shift in priority?
Mr. Dawson.
I believe that the community risk reduction is the future, as I think was pointed out, that fire prevention has really decreased the amount of fire calls that we have to go on, and to better our community's health, that priority needs to be there. With the with the still keeping in mind that we need to be ready for the fires and the high acuity calls, for example, would be heart attacks, strokes, things like that. And as Chief Munder pointed out, our low acuity calls, not that they're any less important, but that they are better mitigated, or that there are better avenues for those, or potential better avenues, I should say. As far as